Okay, I hope I'm audible to all students who are attending this lecture of introductory macroeconomics. Okay, we continue with our lectures on national income accounting. We continue with our lectures on national income accounting. And the book I prefer to follow for my lectures on national income accounting, this is Abel and Bernanke. This is the first reading for the course Introductory Macroeconomics. Okay. So if all students can recall that in the previous lecture of national income accounting, we were looking at how to evaluate the economic activity by using the product approach, income approach, and expenditure approach. And we had taken a practice question based on Orange and Juice Incorporation, where we had calculated the economic activity by all the three approaches, and they were all coming out to be exactly equal, which gave us the national income identity. Okay, so if I now continue with this lecture, let's now talk about the product approach to measuring the gross domestic product. Okay, so first of all, students should be familiar with what is meant by gross domestic product. Okay, so gross domestic product captures the market value of the final goods and services produced within the domestic territory of the country in a given accounting year. So the definition you can see on your screens. This approach defines the nation's gross domestic product as the market value of the final goods and services newly produced within the nation during a fixed period of time. So look at the terms I've circled: market value, final goods and services newly produced within the domestic territory of the nation during a fixed period of time. Okay, so if I just come to the whiteboard to explain this to students, you need to understand the difference between GDP and national income. So GDP is nothing but gross domestic product. GDP is the gross domestic product, which measures the market value, of final goods and services newly produced within the domestic territory of the country, in a given accounting year. This is like the exact definition of GDP. Okay, gross domestic product measures the market value of the final goods and services which are newly produced within the domestic territory of the country in the given accounting year. Okay, if you just a fact, if you look at the GDP of India, so current GDP of India, so the latest figures I have with me right now are 2019 is 2.87 lakh crores US dollars. The current GDP of India is 2.87 lakh crores US dollars. This is as per 2019 data. When I talk about national income is captured by NNP, net national product. Net national product, also called as national income. Now students have done this in high school. If you had economics in high school, you have done that. NNP denotes net national product, also called national income, measures the market value. Let me correct myself. It just measures the value. Actually, national income is evaluated at factor cost, not market price. So you can say that net national product is nothing but at factor cost. Net national product, students can write at factor cost. Net national product at factor cost, which is captured by NNPFC, measures the value of final goods and services produced by the normal residents of a country, produced by the normal residents of the country. Now, who are the normal residents of the country whose center of economic interest lies in that particular economy? So I can write in the bracket whose center of economic interest, whose center of economic interest lies in that economy. Okay. So net national product at factor cost, which we also call as national income. This is nothing but national income. Okay. It measures the value of final goods and services produced by the normal residents of a country in a given accounting year. So students should be able to understand the difference between the gross domestic product and net national product. Okay, in my lectures, I will be explaining to all students what is the difference between the two. But right now, the definition should be clear. Any economic activity which is happening within the domestic territory of the country is a part of gross domestic product. Any economic activity which is done by the normal residents of the country, either within the domestic territory or even outside the domestic territory, is a part of the net national product. So when calculating the GDP, what matters is the domestic territory. So I am underlining it. What matters is the domestic territory. When calculating national income, what matters is the normal residents of the country. Now, you can be a resident of your own country and a citizen of your own country. But you can also be a citizen of your own country, but resident of some other country. So hoping students have understood this. When we talk about national income, territory does not matter. What matters is the normal residents. But when we talk about gross domestic product, only the domestic territory matters, irrespective of whether the output is produced by the residents or the non-residents. Okay, so we don't have to go into the much depth of this. This much explanation is completely sufficient. If I come back to the lecture note, okay, so you can see I have explained all the points in the lecture note point wise. So the first point is market value. So when you are evaluating GDP, goods and services are counted in GDP at their market value. That is the price at which they are sold. This allows you to add the production of different goods and services, because different goods and services can be measured in terms of their market prices. Now, what is the limitation with market value? So you can see the limitation of using market value. A problem with using market value to measure GDP is that some useful goods and services are not sold in the formal markets. Example, homemaking, child rearing services performed within the family. So what your parents are doing for you, what your brothers and sisters are doing for you, you are not paying them. You are not paying them, but these are again services which are done out of love and affection. Your mom, your dad, your brothers, sisters are not asking for salary for their services towards you. But there is no market for this, so these are not a part of the economic activity, although they should be a part of economic activity. Okay, benefits of clean air and water. Now during the pandemic phase, we realize what are the benefits of clean air and water. Okay, so again, there is no market for clean air, there is no price for clean air. So ideally the GDP should be adjusted upwards to reflect the existence of these goods and services. That means we are underestimating the GDP of the economy by not counting services like homemaking, child rearing, benefits of clean air, water, etc. If we also add these activities, our GDP would be inflated upwards. Okay, the problem is that we don't have a market for this. What your parents do for you, there is no market for that. You are not paying them. Okay, so hoping that students have understood the first point. So another concept here also comes regarding the underground economy, also called the black economy. Underground economy, also called the black economy. So some non-market goods and services are partially incorporated in the official GDP measures. Example would be underground economy, which includes both legal activities, which are hidden from the government, as well as illegal activities like drug dealing, gambling, etc. Now again, all activities within the underground economy, whether legal or illegal, are not a part of the market. There is no market for them. Okay, another component which does not pass through the market is the value of services performed by the government. Now guys, when the government is providing us with goods and services, these goods and services are provided by the government at the factor cost, not at the market price. Always remember this. The private sector is going to sell goods and services at the market price, but the government is going to provide defense, public education, bridges, railways at factor cost. So a solution has been adopted to value the government services at their cost of production, which is nothing but the factor cost. Okay, so this is the whole point within the market value. If I quickly revise the market value point again with all students, the goods and services which we capture in GDP are all measured at the market value, which simply means that a market exists for them. But the limitation of using market value is point number one. There are some goods and services for which no market exists, like services performed by your family, clean air and water, etc. Another limitation of using market value is that market value will not capture transactions in the underground economy. The underground economy, the transactions happening within the underground economy are not a part of the market. An underground economy includes legal activities also, which are hidden from the government, like tax evasion, not paying the relevant amount of taxes. It also includes illegal activities like drug dealing, drug smuggling, gambling. So there is no market for them. These are all hidden from the government. And the third problem with using market prices is that whatever goods and services are provided by the government are at the factor cost. Although market exists for that, but the government is not selling its goods and services at the market price. The government sells its goods and services at their cost of production, which is nothing but the factor cost. Now, just to make it more interesting for all students, factor cost includes what? If students are wondering what is the part of factor cost is nothing but the payment made to factors of production. You pay rent to land, plus you pay wages to labor, plus you pay the interest on capital, and you pay profits to the entrepreneur. So when we talk about factor cost is the sum of rent, wages, interest, and profits. And when we talk about the market price, now in high school economics, you have done how do we find the market price from the factor cost. So if I come to the whiteboard, there was a formula which students have done in high school economics. This is market price is equal to factor cost plus net indirect taxes, which we capture by NIT. And net indirect taxes are nothing but indirect taxes. Indirect taxes cause the market price to rise, and subsidies cause the market price to fall. When the government gives subsidies, it causes the price in the market to fall. When the government imposes taxes, it causes the market price to rise. So market price is equal to factor cost plus net indirect taxes. Now, when we measure GDP, it is measured at the market price. But when we talk about the government is selling its goods and services at the factor cost. Okay, so hoping all students have understood this particular point and have no doubts. So if I quickly come back to the lecture note, let's come back to the lecture note. So now I am explaining point B, newly produced goods and services. So you can clearly see the points which I have circled in the beginning. We have talked about market value in depth. Now we talk about newly produced final goods and services. That's our next point. Okay, so point B you can see on your screen, explained in depth. GDP includes only those goods and services that are newly produced within the current period. It excludes the purchase or sale of goods that are produced in the previous periods. Example would be market price paid for a newly constructed house is included in GDP. But the price paid in the sale of a used house is not counted in GDP. That means the second-hand goods are not included in GDP because their value was included in GDP in the year in which they were manufactured. So when I am buying a property which is newly built, it will be a part of the GDP. But if I am selling my property next year to some other party, now that becomes a second-hand good. So it will not be included in the GDP because the value of that property was included in GDP in the year in which that property was built. However, if I'm selling my property to some other party and I'm paying the commission to the real estate agent, that commission paid to the real estate agent will be a part of the GDP because these are the fresh services provided by the real estate agent in a given accounting year. So the value of services of the real estate agent involved in the sale of a used house is a part of the GDP because those services are produced in the current period. So hoping students have understood point B. Okay, then let's talk about point C. Point B was newly produced. That means GDP includes only newly produced, not old. Point C talks about final goods and services. So we know from the previous lecture that intermediate goods and services are those which are used in the production of final goods and services in the same period in which they themselves were produced. That means Intermediate goods are those goods which are used to produce final goods. And a surprising thing about intermediate goods is that they completely lose their existence to become the final good. If I talk about wood and chair, so wood is an intermediate good, chair is a final good. When wood is used to make chair, wood completely loses its existence. Exactly in the same period in which the wood was purchased. So we can say that final goods and services are not intermediate. They are the end products of a process. So only the final goods and services are counted in the GDP. So GDP does not include intermediate goods, because if you are counting intermediate goods in GDP, you are simply creating the problem of double counting. Okay, now students need to understand something very important. What is the difference between intermediate goods and capital goods? Okay, so as you can see on your screen, distinction between intermediate goods and capital goods. Now guys, intermediate goods are also used to make final consumer goods. Capital goods are also used to make final consumer goods. The only difference is intermediate goods will completely lose their existence to become the final good. Capital goods will still retain their existence. So a capital good is a good which is itself produced and is used to produce other goods. Unlike an intermediate good, a capital good is not used up in the same period that it is produced. Hence, the national income accounting classifies capital good as a final good to be included in the GDP. So capital goods are a part of the GDP. So if I come to the whiteboard to explain this in more depth to our students, if I talk about intermediate goods, and if I talk about capital goods, now capital goods are also called investment goods. Capital goods are also called investment goods. Okay, so intermediate goods are used to produce, they are used to produce final consumer goods and they lose their existence. They lose their existence in the production process. Capital goods are also used to produce final consumer goods, but they do not lose their existence, in the production process. The example I can take, which makes everything clear, we talk about three commodities. One is pizza, one is cheese, and oven. Now, pizza is a final consumer good. Cheese is also used to make pizza. Oven is also used to make pizza. But cheese will lose its existence to become the final product. So cheese is an intermediate good. But oven will not lose its existence to become pizza. It will still remain oven. It will retain its own unique identity. So oven is a capital good. Now, while calculating GDP, what will you include? In this example, you will include the value of pizza and the price of the oven, the value of the oven. You will not include cheese in calculating GDP because It serves as an intermediate good for making the final consumer good, which is pizza. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. So capital goods, I can say, are included in the GDP. Intermediate goods are not included in GDP. Okay, so hoping students have understood this. And guys, if I come back to the lecture note, now there is another important distinction to understand. Another important distinction is between the intermediate goods and the final goods arises in how do you treat inventory investment. Now inventories are what? Inventories are stock of unsold finished goods, goods in process and raw materials held by the firms. And if you look at the formula, if students had accountancy in high school, you know that change in stock is nothing but closing stock minus opening stock. So I can say my inventory investment is nothing but closing stock minus the opening stock. And inventory investment is going to capture those stock of unsold finished goods, goods in process and raw materials which are held by the firm. So should inventory investment be treated as a final good? Yes. Inventory investment is treated as a final good and thus the part of the GDP because increased inventories implies greater productive capacity in the future. Now guys, what all inventory investment includes? Inventories include stock of unsold finished goods, goods in process. Now goods in process and raw materials, now when they are a part of the inventory investment, they are not used up in the same period in which they are produced. Understand this. If raw materials are produced in say 2020, but they are used in 21, they will be treated as a final good for 2020. But if raw materials are produced in 2020 and they are used for further production in 2020 year only, now they will become intermediate goods. So basically intermediate goods are those goods which are used to produce final goods in the same period in which the intermediate goods themselves were produced. But if intermediate goods are produced in 1 year, but are used to make final goods in some other year, then that year for which the intermediate goods are produced, they will be taken as final goods. So when we talk about inventory investment will also include raw materials which are not used in that particular year but will be used later by the firms. So for that particular year, these raw materials will become final goods. That means time also matters. If you are using intermediate goods in the same period when they were produced to make final goods, they are not a part of GDP. But if the intermediate goods are produced in 1 year but they are used in the next year, then the year when the intermediate goods are produced for that year, they are a part of inventory investment and they will be treated as final goods and included in the GDP. Okay, so guys, this is where I intend to stop in this particular lecture. We'll start with the difference between GDP and GNP in the next lecture of national income accounting. So we'll talk about what is GDP, what is GNP, and what is the difference between them. So the purpose of this lecture was to cover with all students the concept of product method in depth, where we have looked at the characteristics of the product method. And we are only left with one small characteristic, which is the difference between GDP and GNP, which I intend to cover in the next lecture of national income accounting. And then we are going to start in depth the expenditure method. So this is where I stop. I hope all students have enjoyed this lecture. Any doubt, you can unmute your mic and ask, or call up or mail me your doubts at divineschoolofeconomics@gmail.com. So this is where I stop in this lecture.